That's the cheer for the medical workers that happens every night at 7 p.m. here in New York City ever since the coronavirus outbreak began. I've been reading a lot of editorials and kind of secondary opinion literature where people and experts are trying to find the silver lining of the coronavirus. I understand the impulse, but that's not how I've been thinking about it. In his book, Less Than Nothing, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek says that at its most minimal, historical thought is, quote, the endorsement of a certain impossibility. After a true historical break, one simply cannot return to the past or go on as if nothing happened. Even if one does, the same practice will have acquired a radically different meaning. End quote. And this, I think, is a really good way of thinking about COVID. It's not that it has opened a way forward so much as that it has revealed that there is no way back. It's forcing us to look at the future and try to settle accounts with it. Try to assume the fact that one way or another, that's the only place there is to go, and it is going to be different from what we have today. What it means for an event to kind of close off the past and force you to reckon with the future is going to be the subject of this episode. It's part 2 of, I think at this point, a 3-part episode. So if you haven't heard the episode called The State of the World Today, I encourage you to go back and listen to that one first. Here we go. I'll try to make this one a little bit more optimistic than last time. This is capital A, episode 7, The State of the World Tomorrow. Despite the heaviness of some of this subject matter, I've actually really been looking forward to this episode for a really long time because in order to kind of set the stage for a discussion of some of the alternative ideas for structuring human society that have come out in the last 10, 15 years, I want to start by tackling one of my absolute favorite books of all time, which is Slavoj Žižek's Less Than Nothing. It's an extraordinarily intimidating work. It's 1,000 dense pages long, and it took me a solid year to read. I kid you not. I had to reread each page 2 or 3 times to understand what was going on, and I'm still not entirely sure that I've got all the ins and outs of it figured out. But I feel confident enough that I will be able to convey the parts of it that I think are most relevant for our situation now. And I really just can't stress enough how different Žižek's thinking here is. I think it's fresh and new, and in my humble opinion, I think it's the most important work of philosophy that's been published in the 21st century by far. So buckle in. I really hope you're as excited about this as I am. To start, Žižek is writing this book on the background of everything that we talked about last time. This sort of new world order that developed after the collapse of communism in 1991 and the ascendance of Western-style liberal democracy all across the world. As we discussed last time, this ascendancy brought with it a certain unspoken acceptance that we all kind of share, that model, the Western-style liberal capitalist model, is the only game in town. That's all we have to work with. You know, you can make minor or even major improvements to it, but basically, practically no one today is still hanging around waiting for the worldwide proletarian revolution. And Žižek noticed, just as Fukuyama did, that this certainty that this is all we have left brings with it a certain malaise, a certain depressive acceptance or fatalism that is propelling mankind dangerously towards an uncertain catastrophe. The belief that this system that we have today is all that we will ever have goes hand in hand with the belief that there's really nothing you can do about its flaws. Flaws like the impending ecological collapse. These are all kind of accepted in advance as certainties, things that we all just try not to think about because we're all pretty certain that they're going to happen. That catastrophe is lying in wait for us. This is the world. This is the unspoken acceptance that Žižek tries to take a hammer to in this book. And to do this, rather than dust off his marks the way that we might expect him to, what he tries to do is to up the ante by rehabilitating Hegel. Hegel. I cannot overstate the radical nature of this gesture, because if there is an unpopular philosopher today, it's Hegel, right? Hegel is remembered today as this sort of like doddering early 19th century patriarchal colonialist bourgeois figure who thought that he had figured out all of world history from the comfort of his armchair. He is someone that we look to today to think that's how not to do philosophy. And for reasons that I will try to elucidate, Žižek decides that this is the person that we should all be looking to today. Žižek's argument is essentially that we've all been misreading Hegel for 200 years. Rather than this, loopy professor who thinks he's figured out the absolute end goal of human history, according to Žižek, the real Hegel is a proponent of a radically open system. Rather than describing a world where history is following a deterministic logic that it has had from the very beginning towards a goal that you can't change, the world that Hegel is describing, according to Žižek, is a world in which anything can happen. All the options are open. Radical change can happen at any time. This reading essentially flies in the face of 200 years of Hegel scholarship, which again stresses the absolute closure of Hegel's system. This idea that history is determined in advance by a divine plan, the plan of spirit actualizing itself in the world. Žižek contends that those readers who see this closed Hegel are conveniently ignoring the fact that Hegel says repeatedly, the process of discovering the truth is constitutive of the truth itself. That is, the truth is created by the process of looking for it. And what could that mean, says Žižek, other than you create truth every time? That every time there is a big historical change, the new truth is created out of nothing right then and there. It's not that you're discovering something that was planned for you to discover eons ago by the kernel of spirit or by the divine maker. Rather, that new situation that happens after every impossible event is completely new and unexpected. Žižek asks us to imagine what the world would have to be like for human beings to actually be free, really free. We know from science that there's essentially two possible pictures of the universe that physics offers us. One is a sort of determinist model in which all of the atoms and all of the molecules in the universe are bouncing around like pinballs in accordance with ironclad laws, and that if you knew all of their positions at any given moment, you'd be able to predict history from now until the end of time. In that world, the world of classical physics, it's pretty clear that there is no room for human freedom or agency. You are made up of molecules, and molecules obey the laws of physics. Everything that you will ever do was determined in advance by the initial conditions of the Big Bang. The other model is the sort of aleatory or chance-based model offered by quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics essentially says that at the subatomic level, certain interactions are impossible to predict in advance, even if you knew all of the initial conditions and even if you understood all the laws of physics. That there is a certain element of chance in the universe. Unfortunately, this model is no more amenable to the concept of human freedom because in this model, rather than being determined in advance by the motion set forth by the Big Bang, your actions are determined by pure chance. Pure chance is not freedom. It's just randomness. So, if those are the two options that science offers us, what would the world have to be like for human beings to actually be free? Žižek's answer is what he calls ontological incompleteness. This is the world that Žižek believes the real Hegel actually sees. It's a world that was essentially left unfinished by whatever forces shaped it, whether that's God or the Big Bang or whatever. It's a world where there are pockets of reality that simply haven't been filled in yet, where the details aren't set yet. The metaphor that Žižek uses is of a video game, where your character wanders a little bit too far from the path that the programmers foresaw, and discovers that all of those pretty little trees that you saw in the background are actually flat pixels. That you can't go into the forest that you saw in the background because the programmers didn't think it was necessary for you to do so, and so they left that part of the world incomplete. Now, Žižek kind of goes into some examples from quantum mechanics that are supposedly showing that this world is possible, that this kind of incomplete model of the universe is actually a possibility. And as far as I know from conversations I've had with some physicists that I know, it is possible, although nothing in the current literature suggests that it is in fact the case. But leaving that aside, assuming that it is possible, what does that picture of the world mean for human freedom? To illustrate how a radically open system might function, Žižek leans on a distinction first put forward by the French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. A distinction between chance on the one hand and contingency on the other. Chance, for Meillassoux, is one of a set of options that are determined as possible in advance. You flip a coin. The two possible options are it lands on heads and it lands on tails. You don't know which one, but those are the options. That's chance. Contingency is the intervention or the occurrence of something that was not previously believed to even be an option. So you flip a coin, and rather than landing on heads or tails, it lands on platypus or communist revolution. That's contingency. Contingency is the occurrence, as if by a miracle, of something that had not even been counted among the options. Something like, for example, the election of Donald Trump. in 2016. Although, of course, we're not talking here about natural science, but political science. Nevertheless, our belief system did not factor that in even as a possibility. That's contingency. And Žižek's point, and this is something that other philosophers have spoken of also, is that every time one of these contingencies occurs, it radically restructures the field. Not only the field of what is possible and what the experts consider to be the rules of the game, but also, and crucially, the field of the past. That is to say, when one of these contingencies occurs, everything that had happened up to that point suddenly looks different. Suddenly, it looks like it had all been leading up to this. And I think the 2016 election is really a case study for this because a number of things happened with the election of Trump. One, all the experts, all the people that had learned all the rules of all the games were completely baffled. No one saw this coming except for a handful of fringe thinkers like Michael Moore. Two, suddenly you saw, as if out of nowhere, the ascendance of a completely new field of experts, right? Like, Trump was a fringe figure until he became elected, at which point suddenly there's all these people around him, people that are either pretending or have actually been along with him for the ride this whole time, and who see this completely unexpected turn of events as simply the new world order. You know what I mean? Like, what woodwork did Kellyanne Conway crawl out of? Where did Sean Spicer come from? Like, these were normal people a day ago, and then the next day after Trump is elected, suddenly they've already been his lieutenants marching under his banner like true believers and foot soldiers in his revolution. Like, when did this happen? When did Lindsey Graham become a Trump bro? It's like these people are saying, what are you talking about, dude? We've always believed this. We've always been at war with East Asia. That's how quickly a new world order metastasizes around an impossible event. That's how quickly the impossible restructures the field. Thirdly, in retrospect, the intervention of a contingency, of one of these impossible events, changes the way we think about everything that happened up until that point. So in my view, and I know that this is not a view that many of you are likely to share, when Trump became elected, I suddenly saw the Obama presidency differently. I suddenly saw Obama as this figure for whom change was just a rhetorical device, that if he had actually lived up to his promises, that this wouldn't have happened, that in fact, far from being the savior, he was a harbinger of doom. We can argue that point, but another example might be the Russian Revolution of 1917. From our vantage point in 2020, knowing that the Soviet Union was to collapse in 1991, the Russian Revolution looks like some kind of freak accident of history, this evolutionary dead end, this spontaneous outburst of strange and unaccountable energy that was destined for failure. But imagine if the revolution had succeeded. Imagine that if instead of the Soviet Union collapsing in 1991, it was the West, and suddenly communism spread all over the world. From that perspective, the Russian Revolution would have looked like the first sign of things to come, the inevitable knock of fate on the door. This effect, this ability of an impossible event to retroactively restructure the field and change the way we see everything that was leading up to it, is what Žižek calls the retroactive positing of presuppositions, which is a fancy term for saying, in hindsight, everything looks necessary. In hindsight, everything that happens suddenly looks as if it were leading up to this, even if, in fact, what happened were a pure contingency. Something that happened to happen this way, but could have happened some other way, in which case the past would have looked entirely different again, in a completely new light. The retroactive positing of presuppositions is a mechanism by which we come to believe that history has a plan, and that, crucially, we would come to believe this even if there were no plan. It's the mechanism by which we say to ourselves, everything that happens happens for a reason. No matter what, in fact, actually happened. No matter whether or not there actually was a reason, we look back on the past leading up to this moment and we think that was necessary. I see now where it all started. And before anyone is able to pat themselves on the back too much and say, well, that's not how I think of it, that's not how I see history, I think history is a totally random sequence of events and there is no divine plan. That is the kind of thinking that we engage in every time we look back at, say, the collapse of the Soviet Union and say, well, that was necessary. Like, capitalism won because it is the best system that we have come up with so far. That is a species of this kind of retroactive positing of presuppositions. Without making any claims one way or the other, because I definitely don't think the Soviet system was necessarily better than the American system, you wouldn't be saying this if that had been the system that won out. And really, we don't know necessarily why it was one rather than the other. We are all amateurs in human history, making up stories in hindsight to explain to ourselves things that we don't completely understand. So to recap, for Žižek, rather than the philosopher of fundamental and absolute certainty, Hegel is a sort of radical skeptic, a philosopher that is describing the story that history tells in retrospect, that makes it look necessary, even though at any point anything could have happened. For Žižek, there is only one thing that this radical skeptical Hegel is certain of, and that is that this too shall pass. That is the fundamental principle of the Hegelian system, that every era of history, every system, every set of rules, every reality we ever come to know is temporary. None of it is perfect. None of it is complete. None of it is the absolute form of the world that history has been tending towards. They all have fissures. They all have cracks. And all you have to do is stand aside and let those cracks do their work, and that figure of consciousness, that reality will also crumble, leading to something else that is also new and also unexpected and also radically different from everything that came before it. It's hard to stress enough just how humble this worldview is. Whereas most of us remember Hegel as this kind of arrogant asshole that thought he had it all figured out, Žižek's Hegel is someone who is deeply modest, someone who is even more modest than the modest Kant. Remember, Kant was this philosopher that first said that all we can know is the inside structure of our own minds. Kant looked out onto the world and he saw flaws, inconsistencies, and he said these flaws must mean that we are looking at the world through the lens of our imperfect human minds. Žižek says Hegel's position is even more modest than this. Rather than ascribing these fissures, these empty points to the insides of our own minds, Hegel says, why do we say that our minds are imperfect and that the universe is perfect? What hubris do you have to assume that the world out there is fully constituted? Isn't it just as easy or even easier to say that those flaws are not in my mind, but in the world out there? That incompleteness is not inside my head, that incompleteness is simply the way things are. Why do we have to assume perfection in the world out there? Compare this to Plato, who Žižek also has a materialist rereading of, and this actually forms a pretty significant part of the system that Žižek is presenting in this book. For Plato, human beings look out onto the world, and just as with Hegel, and just as with Kant, the world that they see is flawed. There are fissures in it, cracks in its surface, things that don't make sense, not just politically, but even logically. Just like Kant, Plato takes this to mean that there must be something more. And his theory, of course, is the theory of the forms, that these ideas that we have of perfection, perfection that we never see in the world out there, these ideas must exist somewhere. Or else, where do we get them? Where do we get these ideas? And for Plato, the answer, of course, is that there's another realm, a whole nother Platonic heaven where these ideas live and are, just in and of themselves, in actuality. Žižek's take on this is somewhat different. For Žižek's materialist Plato, the idea of perfection, the idea of justice, even the idea of cows or the color blue or human beings, is not something that is literally out there somewhere in some Platonic heaven. It only exists in our minds. But that doesn't make it any less real. The point of this whole system that Žižek has been elaborating is that there are gaps in the world. Real, true gaps in the world. And those gaps can be filled in by human beings in attempts to reach those ideas. That is to say, an idea, as immaterial and as virtual as it is, can have a true and real effect on the world we see around us. For Žižek, very often a contingency is the interjection into the world, the injection into the world of a human idea. An idea which never happens the way that we intend it to, or the way that we wanted it to, or the way that it exists in our minds, but nevertheless has an impact on the world. What else is the French Revolution, for example, but an instance of an idea actually impacting the course of world events? And again, this doesn't make Žižek an idealist. Žižek is an honest-to-goodness materialist in the sense that he doesn't think that this entity called the idea exists somewhere. But the fact that it doesn't exist doesn't stop it from actually impacting the course of world events. That's the paradox. And that paradox can only happen, according to Žižek, in a world that is ontologically incomplete, in a world that you don't know the end of the story to. Why is that? The fundamental argument of the book is that the world has holes in it. It is incomplete. In Žižek's words, it is less than nothing. In order to make the world functional, to bring it up to the zero level, the base level, the level at which it has a minimum consistency so that you can move around and do stuff in it, what you need is a story, a narrative, an ideology. Not to get too technical, but Žižek, following Lacan, calls this story that you impose on the world to give it meaning the big other. This big other can be anything. It can be a religion, it can be a belief that the revolution is coming, it can be the norms and practices that ground your small, organic, probably conservative community. But whatever this ideology is, it fills in the gaps in the incomplete universe with some manner of consistency that lasts for at least a little while. Unfortunately or fortunately, every ideology has its own gaps, and it's not able to completely cover up the cracks in the world for very long. So every so often, these cracks and inconsistencies become apparent again, and then it is time for a new big other. And the new big other happens when an impossible event occurs, an event that was completely unforeseeable in the parameters of the previous system, the previous set of rules, the previous ideology. This impossible event can be good or bad. It can be the election of Barack Obama, it can be the election of Donald Trump, it can be COVID-19, but whatever it is, it comes along and it creates a new reality. It coalesces a new worldview around it. The conclusion that he draws from this is that in order to effect real change, you do not have to act on the world directly. In fact, you can't act on the world directly. You can only act on the world through your big other, your ideology. Despite the fact that we have no access to the real, we can intervene in the real through the symbolic, through our worldviews and ideologies and customs and all those myths that we set up to create the illusion of a minimal consistency for ourselves. That is the way to change the world, to change the view of the world, because that view really does impact the world by clearing the space for an interjection into it of an event that was previously thought to be impossible. That's why an ontologically incomplete world is the only world in which human beings can be free. Because not only is an ontologically incomplete world one in which there are gaps in the causal sequence, gaps where the story hasn't been written yet, but also because an ontologically incomplete world is the only world that requires human ideas to make it consistent. And those human ideas can be changed. So, I've only just scratched the surface with this book. In fact, I've only just scratched the surface of the first half of this book. The second half is devoted to Lacan, and I'm not crazy enough to try to go into that in this episode, but I want to try to wind this episode down with the practical political implications of this view, at least as best as I understand them. 1. Don't give in to despair, because no matter how impossible things seem, what right have you to say that you know how this story ends? What kind of hubris does it take to say, I know that we are doomed, that ecological catastrophe is inevitable, that it's all been leading up to this? You didn't foresee the Russian Revolution, you didn't foresee the collapse of the Soviet Union, you didn't foresee the election of Barack Obama or Donald Trump. But at each and every step, you said to yourself, now I have it figured out, and you are still saying this to yourself today. You are still saying, I know how it all ends. That isn't Hegel. That's you. That's the cartoonish Hegel that you remember, who thought he had the universe figured out from the comfort of his armchair. You are that Hegel. In actuality, the impossible happens with regular frequency, and each and every time that it happens, your human brain fills in the gaps in your worldview with a new theory, and you are equally convinced of the truth of that theory. Take a break from prophesizing the doom of the human race, because for better or for worse, and really I think for better, you don't have this all figured out. And that's a good thing. 2. We didn't go into this one as much, but I'll just say it now. It is a lesson of the book. Don't be afraid to get stuck. For some pretty cool and complicated reasons, Žižek believes that things change precisely when things get stuck. And that stuckness is what we're seeing today. It's the harbinger of a new world, at least according to Žižek. 3. Don't be afraid of your own power. That seems like a strange thing to say today when we're all feeling like we have no agency at all and no say whatsoever, but actually one of the primary messages of contemporary ideology is don't rock the boat. Remember from last time, the idea of capitalism is that it is the worst system ever tried, except for all the other systems that have ever been tried. So the best thing you can do is to let it alone, lest you screw something up irrevocably. This point is actually wonderfully corroborated by Thomas Piketty's work, Capital and Ideology, which essentially says that the basic reason that the citizens of Europe in the 19th century were prepared to accept the highest levels of income and wealth inequality in human history was because of this idea that if you rock the boat too hard on the private property system, anything could happen. Chaos would ensue, terror, the guillotine. So ironically, one of the fundamental messages of ideology in this age where we're all despairing of our ability to have any effect whatsoever on the world is don't rock the boat. Be afraid of your own power. Žižek's message is don't be afraid of your own power. The world has and will continue to change completely every few decades. There's no way to predict it, there's no way to stop it, so you might as well try for the better world inside your mind. This idea that you have, which you might not even know where it comes from, because it certainly has never existed out there. The idea with a capital I. What Michelangelo called the dream of human life. So, what are those ideas? Last episode, I ended on the hint that the crises of climate change, the widening wealth gap, the rise of neo-fascism, etc., that these crises were putting pressure on the ideological system that has ruled the world since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that what's exciting to me is that there are some new ideas that have arisen in the last few years to respond to that pressure and to create alternative visions for how to structure the world. I promised then that I would talk about those ideas this time, but as you can see, I found it necessary to go into a sort of detour into the theoretical underpinnings of how change is possible at all. So that leaves us this time with where I thought we were last time, with a promise to hopefully address two of the more practical plans for human development that have arisen in the last few years, and that is the idea of post-scarcity and the idea of degrowth. Those are the only ideas that I'm aware of that present themselves as actual serious attempts to think an alternative way of structuring society. And I'm by no means an expert in them, but I will try to go into what those are and how they work, and perhaps much more importantly, what the sources are for understanding them in the next episode. Thank you for sticking with me through this episode. I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say about it, and don't be afraid to write or respond in any way that you think is appropriate. Before I sign off here, I'll end with the standard plea that if you feel you've gotten something out of this, that you just share it and subscribe to it, and do all those things that make the algorithms happy. It would really help me out a lot. Thanks again for sticking with me. I look forward to discussing post-scarcity and degrowth with you next time. And if there's just one phrase that I could say here to summarize Žižek's book, it's that there will always be a next time. So until then, this has been Capital A.